Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me. My name is Nicole Jera. I'm a gender fluid, LGBTQIA plus ally, and Christian patriot. Welcome to my channel, Turtle Island Tetragrammaton. I'm happy you're here. I'm gonna make my screen smaller little window. And I'm reading today an article. What article is this? Why does it matter? I don't remember exactly where I found it. I'm not gonna bother to so I found this website. Yeah. So I pulled out this link to a website reading an article about Ken Cousins, who's a controversial figure in the transformation business. The transformation business. Maybe I'm actually going to put this one on the other channel. I'm going to put this one on my other channel. I don't know. I'm just going to read this article. I have no idea what it's about. But pretty much I just wanted to read this 20-page document. And I figure I'd just read it here. Hidden Histories. This was a 2012 website. All rights reserved, so they're not going to be happy about me reading this. Each article is presented to give everyone possible source to truth available. Discerning truth is the responsibility of each reader. TGS Publishers, hiddenmysteries.com. Out of Texas, TGS Hidden Mysteries. The Magazine, THE, whatever that means. The Esoteric Magazine. So I'm involved in a private society called Pantera Vita. You can find them at panteravita.org unless you wanted to visit their public channels called Freedom Absolute at Freedom Absolute. They have a paid subscription model to join their school, which I am a part of. So can I make it bigger? So keep in mind, this is a little outdated. This was probably written in 2010 or 2012. Around that time frame. It is now 2025, so we're a few years off from that. But Ken Cousins wrote this article, and it might inform his perspective and where he's coming from. So this is the Hidden Mysteries magazine, Holographic History, and the end of a great cycle. Quote, and in the end, we shall meet ourselves once again and know ourselves for the first time. End quote. History, as we currently, quote, know it, is a revised edition, revisionist reconfiguring of linear events to a predetermined destination, and thus is a predetermined mindset for the largely unthinking mass consciousness as we observe it today. Upon closer scrutiny, when real thinking and inquiry is applied to this revisionist text, we must first discard all the usual signposts that we have been, quote, taught to view history through and within. One of these signposts that we take as, quote, normal, but is really just another revisionist trick of the magicians and spin doctors, is the linear nature of history and of time itself. Time is not linear. It is spherical and holographic. History, therefore, is not linear. And the revised editions are not only written forward towards a predetermined destination, it is also written backwards, revised from the back end, starting from the predetermined conclusion and being filled in accordingly all the way to the beginning. That's better. The real question we must then ask is why and how did the spin doctors know the destination in the first place from which to spin their tale both forwards and backwards? The answer is quite simple, and when considered objectively and without the mindset of the spin, is painfully obvious. The answer is simply that the destination was inherent in the inception. There was a known and specified constant that guided the so-called, quote, great work of the ages, end quote, towards its goal from the beginning. The question then to be asked is, what beginning are we talking about? And in order to answer that question, let us discuss time and establish a context from which to proceed. Time is not some mechanistic, incremental division of linear progression. Real time is fluid, cyclic, and based on cosmic and astronomical proportions. Our relative position in space determines our cyclic unfoldment in time. In space, our solar system moves fluidly around a relative center in a cycle we can call a solar year. Approximately 26,000 of our annual cycles around the center of the solar system, our sun. Perpendicular to the ecliptic path inscribed by this solar movement emanating from that central point is a band of energy that we enter at each midway point, or approximately every 13,000 years. The central sun that we revolve around is in the center of the Pleiadian system and is called Alcyone. I didn't know that. The emanation from this central point around which we revolve is referred to as the photon belt due to its higher concentration of photonic particles of light found therein. Our, quote, reality on this planet is inseparable from our consciousness, being as we are all essentially virtual reality projecting units, and more bluntly stated, creator beings currently inhabiting planetary bodies made up of an etheric envelope interwoven through a combined physical, emotional, and mental corporeal form and projecting reality therefrom. In common vernacular, this means we are creating our reality and we are inseparable from that which we create. And if that reality that we create is based on an emotional, mental, and psychic content that defines itself as isolated and separate from its own source, when that reality construct enters an accelerated and super excited state as a result of entering into that higher energetic photon belt, we cannot hold onto our reality construction, and we must either fall to a lower state of consciousness within that reality or be removed from it entirely. Suppose, then, that around 13,000 years ago, we were not, collectively speaking, as the entire human race then in incarnation on the planet, anywhere near a state of balance and integration within the planetary vehicles we occupied, and thereby were significantly out of alignment with our true and divine natures. Suppose certain less than entirely well-meaning beings entered into the picture at about that time and used that situation as an opportunity to gain control of the system, the reality, the construct that we, as its creators, could not control or maintain consciousness within. Suppose that certain inherent laws still in place in this system and the universe that it is contained within still required certain procedural constraints that could not be avoided. What are such procedural restraints? Let's call them divine laws relative to cosmic procedure. Let's say within the current vernacular that we might understand, a legal framework was required for entry into a new port. Let's call such legal framework a treaty that established rules of the game and procedural protocol that could not be circumvented, but certainly within the context of the letter of such a legal contract could be distorted and manipulated. Let's also remind ourselves within this context that there are no enemies, there are only opportunities, and that the intrusion of the above referenced less than entirely well-meaning beings only appear that way because our collectively distorted picture of reality had a context within its inherent structure in which an outside, quote, enemy would intrude into the picture and take control. Generally speaking, for those who have delved into such subject matter, the end of the last cycle is known as the downfall of civilization known as Atlantis. But since we are dealing with massive distortions and manipulations within the current hologram we occupy, let us not allow ourselves the luxury of believing anything we think or have thought as being real. Many of those with a metaphysical and esoteric bent consider the basic truth about Atlantis to be that it fell a cataclysmic fall around the time we are referring to. It crashed under its own weight and was buried under the ocean. So as we have been told, so we believe to be true. But what if that is not the whole story? Therefore, let us consider here another possibility. Let's consider the possibility that Atlantis and the Atlantean race was not so much a civilization or a race or a period of history, but within the holographic and spherical scheme of things, Atlantis was a building block in the evolutionary development of the human species towards its ultimate perfection of an integrated vehicle through which our consciousness could be free and without limit to explore a universe that we have always been part and parcel with, a universe that we are, in fact, the co-creators of, in a grand and unprecedented experiment. Consider that, in such an experiment, we required of ourselves the ability to move through all layers or dimensions of such creation, and therefore required a complete and integrated vehicle with which to traverse such a domain, which of course includes the physical dimension we currently find ourselves, shall we say, trapped within. Consider that Atlantis was the phase within which we were perfecting the mental body of this multidimensional vehicle, following the perfection of the first three required bodies, those being the etheric, physical, and emotional. The original envelope of the etheric body, known as the Polarian, was designed to deal with the electromagnetic polarities encountered in the planetary sphere we were engaging with. The physical body was known as the Hyperborean because it was the extension out of the etheric body through the North Pole, Borean referring to the north, then to the Lemurian, which was the creation of the emotional body, leading to the Atlantean, the fourth or mental body. Taken all together, this fourfold envelope was designed and intended to be a fluid, dynamic vehicle with which to interact, engage, and create within the realm of our own creation this unique and extraordinary planetary sphere known as Earth. Earth, or Gaia, is the eighth tone of the Pleiades, known to us throughout legend and history as the Seven Sisters, with its central sun, Alcyone, around which we revolve through the solar system through the solar cycle referenced above, the eighth tone, or the completion of the octave. And like any octave within a musical progression, becoming the harmonic of the original tone, and the starting point for the creation of a whole new octave. But these are only four bodies of what in actuality is a total of 9 interwoven matrices of our intended, integrated whole system with which to explore and create in our own universe, and new universes yet to come. The fifth part, known as the Aryan body, is the fulcrum point between the planetary and the extraplanetary bodies. In a numerological system of 9, 5 is the center point, the integrator, and the balance point. But what if that fulcrum could be supplanted by a usurping race that considered it right and proper within their own frame of reference that they should usurp such a pivotal position and claim as their own the previously established four parts of the whole, and by so doing prevent us from attaining the other half of the equation. Consider the possibility that this usurping race originated from a system known as Orion, entering through the Himalayan and Caucasus mountains. Oh, some 85,000 years or so, within our linear frame of time. And consider the possibility that, as distasteful as it might be, there was an imperative and rightful reason for such an intrusion. Why? Because consider the fact that, as creators of our own reality, there was something misaligned and distorted within our reality construct that allowed such an intrusion to take place. If the distortion was not there, then consistent with the nature of reality, within a whole system, such an intrusion could not have taken place. If this is the case, then something was required from outside to play out an externalized manifestation of an already existing internal misalignment. In other words, if it isn't within the internal landscape picture of reality, then it cannot manifest externally. And what could such a misalignment have been? Well, long ago, as we might reckon time, a long, long time ago, the earth resided in a plane of consciousness that was pristine and without blemish. It was a jewel in the crown of creation. It resided in an idyllic level of reality, yet it could not move forward. It was, in essence, stuck. The Buddha had reached nirvana, and after countless eternities, to put it bluntly, he was bored. Along with this, he needed to understand a few important and essential elements of the divine mind within which he found himself. He needed to understand compassion, mercy, and forgiveness. We use the masculine pronoun here, but there was, at this time, no such distinction. This was the Garden of Eden, long before Adam and Eve were separated. The earth and her Buddhic nature were one and the same. Be that as it may, the earth and her local companions were preparing for a graduation to the next dimensional plane within the many mansions of this local universe that we are speaking of. But within this local universe, there were cumulatively approximately 6 billion individualized souls that had not achieved a level of integration required to make such a shift. As such, they would be left behind and dissolved back into the primal matrix from whence they had sprung. In her impulse towards compassion, mercy, and forgiveness, the earth declared that she would receive these laggard souls and assist in their ascension, thinking her pristine level of perfection and her Buddhic nature would not be adversely affected by such a magnanimous act. But, alas, this was not the case. In receiving these souls, she fell from that level of perfected grace, and slowly and steadily, the accumulated weight of the internal sense of separation within each of those 6 billion souls began to accrue upon the psychic plane of earth, and she entered her period of darkness. What has ensued since that time encompasses eons of time, and much too much to detail to go into here, Suffice it to say, it was a long fall and a long, slow, agonizing climb back up. Along the way, the rebuilding of the planetary bodies from which a new graduation could emerge was accomplished. But along that path, there were still massive layers of accumulated distortions as a result of those illusions of separation that those 6 billion souls had brought with them to this planet, and culminating in the Atlantean Age. When the completion of the mental plane was achieved, something was distinctly misaligned and much in need of assistance. The Atlantean period, while achieving the required perfection of the mental body, found itself in a dilemma. The perfection of the mental body had also achieved something unexpected. It achieved a recreation of the original state of being stuck. The Atlantean reality was a mental plane construct that, although apparently perfect, was still disconnected from much of the consciousness from which it had sprung. If we are indeed creators occupying these bodies, then everything we envision must somehow be established somewhere in, quote, reality. So where was all of the images of separation residing? Somewhere down under, so to speak, somewhere in parallel systems of reality construction, and what we might call, from our limited linear ways of perceiving such things, lower dimensions wherein parts of our multi-dimensional selves were stuck and unable to free themselves. Parallel universes in which the misaligned and distorted energy of our collective miscreations was held in storage until it could be liberated and integrated. And what embodiments did such parts take on? The likes of the inner earth peoples, the gnomes and fairies and elven races, the races from which eventually would spring the indigenous peoples around the earth in this current reality we find ourselves in, all of whom have origin myths that speak of coming up from beneath the earth to found their races and civilizations, races whose inherent natures have been to steward and hold a particular spot upon the grid pattern of the electromagnetic field upon which our physical reality is constructed. They became the Earth Keeper races upon the third dimensional plane, wherein the final showdown and the final convergence was destined to take place. But somehow, those parts of ourselves residing therein had to call in some mechanism to force the collapse of the Atlantean mental construct and bring all the parties and players together in one melting pot reality in which to process all that needed to be processed in order to achieve final integration. Enter stage left our friends from Orion, a distinctly reptilian-like race, cold-blooded, self-serving, and within and without much or any emotional content. In short, a race much in need of the lessons of mercy, forgiveness, and compassion itself. Enter then those beings who would play out the projected and externalized abrogation of our own power and authority, who would play out the God spell of the last 13,000 years, who entered into a legally and lawfully binding contract, a treaty, if you will, allowing them, within this free will zone, to create a holographic reality and control system in which the crucible of all the elements of our collective consciousness would be forced to deal with itself and achieve the true prize of the ages: integration, balance, and an opening of the heart centers to allow the divine nectar to flow of mercy, compassion, and forgiveness. Ultimately, to achieve the intonation of the octave of this universe whose essence, though largely obscured in our current reality construct, is indeed divine love. Unless and until we realize and truly accept that this has taken place, that the beings currently in control of this reality were invited and contracted to come into this agenda, then we and they will not be able to leave. But if we do accept this fact, then we all shall be able to take our next steps. And the most important element to be aware of at this time concerning this little scenario is that that treaty has lawfully binding clauses that must be abided by, the most central of which is that the fourth dimensional energetic overlay that has maintained this hologram we have played out our karma and our dharma within over these last 13,000 years must be removed exactly on New Year's Day 2000, the new millennium. And how, you might ask, is such a coincidence possible? Simply because it is no coincidence. For remember that the beginning point of this discussion was that revisionist history was written in both directions, and the end point has always been known by those in control or seeming control since the beginning, and that such events as the creation of the Julian calendar 2,000 years ago and the readjustment in the year 1582 to its current so-called Gregorian form were created, constructed, and adjusted so that history would arrive at its predetermined endpoint so long ago, established at the beginning of this cycle in precisely the timing and the linear point desired by those writing the story, of which there is more yet to tell. Imagine a holographic construction in consciousness, a world in which flying ships move breathlessly and without sound through a pristine sky, a world in which buildings glow with an inner crystalline light that is golden-hued, a world in which people move and breathe and have their being in such a state of mental perfection, order, and harmony, but a world in which other worlds are trapped within, populated by beings and races that wish to have that one thing that they most are kept from: freedom. Imagine an invasion of dark and loathsome beings descending upon the perfected world of Atlantis in dark ships of war, descending upon the vortex points and portals of the planetary body with full knowledge of where to insert their consciousness in such a way as to literally implode the world they have come to subdue and take control of it. Imagine then, when the deed is done, the elders and heads of state gather upon a field of armistice, in which their totems and shields of power must be capitulated into the conqueror's hands. 16 leaders in all, gathered in 2 groups of 8, and each divided still into 2 groups of 4, they lay down their emblems of power and form 4 pillars of light, each pillar itself made up of 4 pillars still, 16 in all, and they then are divided into 2 groups of 8 to form the 2 pillars of Hercules, and the gateway and the threshold that they form shall stand guard over their now deserted reality, and all others shall be thrown down into a veil of darkness. Upon waking, dazed and confused, human beings wake up in many foreign lands with no memory and no past. They are scattered into the 4 directions and over the many lands of around the globe. They are without direction, without leaders, without power. They feel separate, alone, and full of fear, having nothing that they can find sense of self upon which to rely. They begin to look awkwardly towards the sky, mindlessly tracking sun, moon, and stars. At long last, whirling lights appear, and the gods arrive. The pillars that have separated the dimensions and created the ring past not have established the enclosed hologram in which we have been struggling these last 13,000 years. The mute and silent watchers that have formed these pillars are those who surrendered their emblems of power in order that humankind could plunge at last into the depths of its own illusions of separation, to, at long last, release all that was held within the substrata and the multiple layers of reality long ago divorced from their souls. A treaty was created at this juncture in our journey, a treaty that at first might appear cruel and without reason, a treaty that allowed foreign and by all appearances loathsome creatures to take a hold of our consciousness and to create a controlled frequency zone of narrowly defined reality, a reality characterized by separation and fear. Oh, what a paradox, to be locked down in such a reality of separation and fear, while surrounded by a universe built upon a foundation of love. But you see, into this melting pot of a reality have been inexorably drawn the very threads of consciousness upon which this realm has been woven, because all races, beings, and universe and spirits who have contributed to the creation in which we find ourselves must at last and inevitably participate in the final drama of such a catapult force that would carry us literally into the next dimension, at last free, at last integrated, balanced, and whole. So, if we had come face to face with our own illusions and separateness, our own externally abrogated power and authority, then someone had to step in and play out the role of the gods, the controllers, and the power brokers. Enter then the Anunnaki, the Nephilim, the gods who came down, the gods of the Indus Valley, the gods of Sumer and Akkadian, the gods of Egypt and the Americas. Then, eventually, as things evolved, they had to move aside and descend kingship onto the land to allow the humans to play it out among themselves. And therefore they crossbred with some of the humans and created the demiurge, the half-god, half-men who would be kings. And what souls stepped forward to claim such rights to lord power and authority over their fellow humans? Why just such as those from the number of those 6 billion laggard souls who were most separate from themselves and most devoid of their own divinity, those most in need of healing, the rulers and power brokers we see around us today, who are in reality most devoid of true internally grounded power. The treaty signed some 13,000 years ago allowed for certain clauses and contingencies. It allowed for a temporary suspension of the universal law that disallows intervention into a species' free will system. It allowed the creation of a frequency zone in which control over the species could be maintained. In short, it created the institution of slavery that has dominated this planet for most of the last 13,000 years. Why slavery? Because the only path back to power was the reassertion of our free will that would be required to shirk the slavery and reattain our sovereign power and authority. In the process, integration would occur. The release of the dispossessed of the ages would take place. The convergence of the many parallel realities into one singular reality in which we were the masters could occur. The treaty also required certain signs and signposts to be maintained. The remembrance of our true past, path, and history could not be interfered with. The secret hiding places of our memory were to be known as the secret places of the lion. The 2 pillars at the threshold would be the 2 lions, and our path towards integration would be known as the lion's path. It was the dawning of a new age those 13,000 years ago. It was the age of Leo, the age of the lion and the house of Judah. And the Sphinx, with full lion's body, head, and mane faced directly into the rising stars of Leo as it rose in the eastern sky, while the forces of Orion constructed the 3 great pyramids of Giza to lock in the frequency zone and take control of the grid of the electromagnetic sphere of our planet, to align the 3 pyramids with the 3 stars of the belt of Orion, from which control would be maintained. The 3 stars that held the frequencies of dark and light, and the balance of the 2 held in dynamic equilibrium in the spiraling movements of time and space. The treaty also allowed for a 4th dimensional overlay that would keep us locked into the frequency zone for the next 13,000 years. The treaty also required, should there occur an awakening of consciousness at the end of the period, an awakening in consciousness that became aware of the inception of the cycle and its particulars, and declared itself sovereign and without master. In just such an instance, the treaty required that the overlay must be removed. We have awakened. We have become so aware, and we have demanded and required that the overlay be removed. On the fourth dimension, by divine law and universal mandate, such is now taking place. But those who have the bloodlines descended from kingship and the lineage that followed, those still stuck in the third dimensional and having started from a point of the most separation, those in the third dimension in human form who have long labored to perfect their own technologies whereby they might continue to be the masters and continue to control those they believed they owned, perhaps to snap off forever the purposefully maintained weak and tenuous connections such lowly humans had managed to maintain with their divine heritage. Those very ones in control have endeavored to own their fellow humans as their own forever. Those laggard souls who think themselves now to be gods, in their egoic and misconstrued hierarchies of power and dominance, they move right now into place as these words are being written to complete their agenda of the ages in their misperceived self-induced illusions of glory. You see, we humans are much more than we allow ourselves to be. We are indeed partners with creation, partners with our divine source. We are co-creators in this ongoing and eternal game of creation. As such, we are literally biocrystalline, virtual reality projecting units that can indeed be the cause and not at the effect of our own creation. But we can be controlled. We can be entrained by a simple law of mechanics known as sympathetic resonance, in which, like 100 pendulum clocks that begin their mechanistic timing at random, but quickly entrain to each other if placed together in an enclosed environment, we can also be entrained to project our reality projections into a predetermined construction based on fear and separation. We can be divided and thereby conquered, entrained to believe that there is an enemy that is keeping us from ourselves. Our fourth dimensional overlords know this fact very well, and they have been working with their third dimensional counterparts for these last 13,000 years, because they knew one very important fact that we were kept in the dark from. That fact was that there would come a time when the fourth dimensional overlords, by divine law and legally binding contract, would have to leave. So they have spent all these years working and training those on the ground in 3D to achieve an artificially maintained hologram into which the 6 billion incarnate forms on the planet would continue to project the reality of lack and limitation, fear and survival, and thereby be controlled. But now the treaty is over. Those of us who are awake in the game are free. But in order to be free, one must be truly free of all the things that bind: fear, belief in lack and limitation, belief systems of all kinds, belief in limiting sciences, limiting religious forms, beliefs that beliefs are real. For the animal that is domesticated and trained to live on a leash or in a cage will not be able to leave the cage when the bars are removed. It is only the one who knows that the bars were never there in the first place who can walk free from the illusory cage first. In the meantime, let's hold that thought for a moment and look at some further details of this treaty we speak of and come to better understand the pinnacle point upon which we now stand. It is interesting to note that the two principal symbols to be found around the world in royal crests and shields are that of the lion and the dragon. These are the two conflicting images that characterize this period we speaking of. In China, as in Europe, we often find entrances guarded by two lions. While both East and West celebrate their esoteric lineage of the dragon. In the British Isles, 33 years after William the Conqueror brought the largely consolidated power of Rome from the European continent to be seated in the city of London, just past Land's End, an island known as Lyonese, sunk beneath the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. This happened to coincide with the victory of the First Crusade that reclaimed Jerusalem for Christian Europe. I think it's Lyonesse, Lyonese. The symbol of lioness. The symbol of Lyonese. I don't know how to pronounce that. The symbol of Lyonese was the two lions standing at the entry, pillars and guardians of the gate. The victory that reclaimed Europe introduced a very important piece to our story. For a few short years later, 9 knights from France came to Jerusalem to begin excavations under the ruins of the temple. They continued excavations until they found what they had come for: documents, seals, scrolls, and implements of power, among which is what we know as the Ark of the Covenant. Thus started the reemergence of the Lion's Path in its next and most important phase, in which the Templars, as they came to be known, spread throughout Europe and for 2 centuries became the most powerful and influential group, except for the power of Rome. The technology that the Templars found in the temple ruins enabled them to gain knowledge and insight into what we are speaking of here. The so-called Ark was really more of an interdimensional doorway that enabled them to peek into the Atlantean realm and glean the knowledge with which they then built the soaring and magnificent cathedrals of Europe, all of which were placed on powerful telluric points of convergence of the planetary body, disguised as monuments to the glory of Rome, but really holding the secrets of the Lion's Path and the avenue by which we could find our way to our final integration. Specifically, there are 7 main cathedrals that follow an ancient path, starting from the southernmost point in western Spain at the Cathedral of St. John of Compostela, which grounded in the root chakra, and proceeding north to Toulouse in southern France, Orleans, Chartres, Notre Dame, Ariens, moving through central and northern France, and then to the 7th point in Scotland at Roslin Chapel, occupying the point of the 7th seal, the crown chakra, under which are buried the artifacts found under the temple and the scrolls and documents containing this history. These 7 points along the path of pilgrimage, of course, correspond to the human energetic system of the 7 chakras, and have provided a holding pattern to maintain our stability in physical form over the last 700 years as we moved collectively towards the culminating point of this whole process and the period we are now in. The Templars established on these sites portals to other realms that would be required as the frequency control was drawn tight around our planetary bodies, as has indeed happened in these last few moments in history. Such portals were required to countermand the other planetary vortex portals held within the control of the opposing forces, portals such as Jerusalem itself, in which many holographic inserts have been placed that have played key roles in the process of divide and conquer. Religions, they are often called. Inserts such as the Savior construct, behind which one might find the Wizard of Oz pulling his many pulleys and levers to maintain the most sophisticated system of control and manipulation the world has ever known. The Savior construct, in which the true presence of our own Christed perfection is obscured. The construct by which all the blinding forms and vows and contracts have been carefully interwoven to bind us to this narrowly defined reality we find ourselves in. The Savior construct, in which many beings continue to project their own power and authority, and thereby abrogate their own divinity outside of themselves, waiting to be saved by church or state, science or religion, or all the gods who consolidated their various franchises into the one God and the one church in all of its fractionalized forms. But as with all good items of control, there is always the inherent potential for revelation of a higher order, and the knowledge that nothing can be inserted into this holographic reality without the corresponding receptacle in consciousness to adhere itself to it. And remember, on a higher level, all has unfolded in divine perfection. For, quote, the devil knows not who he serves, end quote, in which the devil is defined as the misapplication of divine creative capacity into a misaligned distortion of life-negating actions enacted by humans acting out of their own blindness and lack of balance and integration. What that agenda has served is to establish the matrix of our own illusions in which we could finally wake up and jump to the next level, free from the confines of such a system of misalignment and control. In other words, with respect to the savior construct, the human race would not be waiting for an outside force to save it if it were able to integrate its own internal grounding in alignment with its true divine source. Whether the Jerusalem story of 2,000 years ago was an actual event or a mythological insert is really irrelevant. What is important is that the construction could not even exist in this reality if the collective consciousness of the human race did not support it. And even if it has been the most significant element of control ever witnessed, there is something inherently right about it. It established the template that sooner or later allows each individual consciousness to rise above the construction and realize that we ourselves are the ones we have been waiting for. We are the true embodiment and realization of the presence of that unified consciousness referred to as the Christ. And when we take that into ourselves and integrate it with our full beingness, nothing can intervene, and nothing is required to intervene. And when this is achieved, the one prerequisite for lifting of the fourth dimensional overlay is achieved, which is that our consciousness becomes aware of the game it has been playing itself out over these last 13,000 years. And as such, the divine intervention may have called for is achieved. The treaty and its final terms must be enacted, and the overlay is to be lifted. It is being lifted right now as these words are being written. The Egyptian government has just announced that the gold capstone intended to be placed on the top of the Great Pyramid on the moment of the millennial shift will not be allowed. It was this capstone that was intended to lock us into the frequency zone even when the overlay was lifted. And it is simply by virtue of the conscious awareness of the agenda, along with our understanding of this scenario and the treaty itself, that has forced the hand of the opposing forces. And the curtain has been thrown aside, and the wizard stands naked and revealed. When the two pillars were established at the beginning of this cycle we are speaking about, they were held in place by the two beings known as Michael and Zadkiel. Over the ages, these two archangelic beings have come to symbolize two very important principles: truth a divine law. Over the ages, these names have merged into a singular title, held by a priestly lineage that honored Michael and Zadkiel, the later becoming Zadok, and the two combined becoming Michael Zadok, and eventually to the modern pronunciation of Melchizedek. It is the Melchizedek lineage and the order that issued forth from it that has maintained stability in this dimensional progression through which we have traversed during the ages we speak of here. It is the Melchizedek presence that holds the stabilizing force when a planet or a solar system or even an entire universe makes a dimensional shift. We are standing at the precipice of such a shift at this time and are literally at the launching point of a catapult force of energy never before seen in such a shift. It is because we are coming from an extreme level of separation and hence an unprecedented accumulation of stored energy that we are going to be able to literally catapult upwards of 6 billion souls into such a dimensional shift, achieving what Mother Earth has always desired, which is to be a harbor and safe haven for those 6 billion laggard souls that came to her shores so long ago and are now ready to take their next step back into the embrace of their divine and original source. When the overlay is lifted, it will be like blinders that have been removed from our eyes, and it will be like a governor on our transmission is being removed, allowing us to see in ways that we haven't been able to see in millennia, and enabling us to shift gears and accelerate ourselves through the remaining layers of illusion and deceit that have kept us in bondage all of these years. At the same time, the integration of the four bodies described above will move quicker than ever before, and the fifth or fulcrum body will realign itself into its proper function. Next, the integration of the four higher bodies Next, the integration of the four higher bodies that will enable us to ground in our own interdimensional consciousness and facilities will also take place. These are the Boralayan, the sixth root body that establishes our link to the stars through the north node of our etheric envelope, linking us to solar intelligence and the many stepping stones through the stars into higher mansion worlds of infinite creation. Next, the seventh body, the corporean, grounds the integrated Christed body, which is the true capstone, into the blood, and corpuscles of light that resonate with the crystalline spheres of iron, hemoglobin, that then resonate with the central iron sphere in the center of the earth. When thus integrated, we can remain here, in form on the earth, from whence we have drawn up the substance of the bodies we occupy, or we can move upwards into the light through the multi-dimensions beyond. As such, no artificial capstone of gold placed on the pyramids can hold us in the frequency zone any longer, and in fact, the current knowledge and awareness of this very fact has forced the collective consciousness to demand, on inner levels, that no such capstone even be allowed to be placed. The eighth body is the octarian, interfacing with the whole system through an octahedral field that surrounds the entire system as a whole, as well as around every spiraling matrix of biocrystalline light in each cell of the body and each double helical strand of DNA, as well as in the second, fourth, and sixth chakras that correspond to the physical bodies of the material, emotional, and mental planes. The Octarian body is our interface with the languages of light that are photonic wave forms that correspond to every racial and genetic characteristic ever formulated by the infinite creative expression of our divine intent. And once we can access these languages of light, we can travel anywhere and literally be anything, while always remaining centered and whole, and can return to Earth, to home, or to anywhere in creation by focus of intention and will. When this period we are discussing first began, we were cut off from this capacity when the connections to the second and sixth chakras were severed. The sixth, once cut, prevented us from seeing through the illusions of the frequency zone of control we were forced into, and the second was literally turned inside out, so that instead of our true, individualized and natural life force being able to enter into our corporeal form and enliven our bodies, it was inverted, such that we were forced to constantly seek outside of ourselves for our energy and our sustenance. This made it very easy for the human race to be controlled, and for the illusions of the God spell and other control systems based on survival fears and death fears to be so easily implemented. The God spell, by definition, was the spell cast over our sleeping hearts and mind that created the illusion that we were separate from our own divinity, that there was a God or gods outside of us, one that was either wrathful and vengeful, or one that simply did not care. This, of course, established the foundation for the experience of living life based on fear and separation, with an ever-present and overbearing cloud of abandonment and betrayal permeating our reality and underwritten by a constant struggle for survival. This led to the modern basis of control that has been perfected over the centuries through political, economic, and religious forms. Now, as the final clause of the treaty is enacted and the fourth dimensional overlay is removed, it will not take much to move the third dimensional control systems, out of our way to begin to literally dissolve the frequency zone of control. Since reality as we know it is holographic, then each part of the hologram actually contains all of the information of the larger whole. This is the morphogenetic field by which the two original cells form a human being, or a frog, or horse, or any other whole living organism inherent in the morphogenetic blueprint. The whole is contained in each part, thus, one conscious point of awareness, when the inhibitors are removed, will begin to resonate outwards and, like ripples in a pond, affect the entire matrix of the whole. As this begins to pick up momentum by many such points of emanation, meaning individual human beings or small aggregations of such, the majority of the human consciousness, still asleep but only controlled by third-dimensional technology of entrainment without the 4D containment overlay, will begin to lose their grip on that reality construct. This will allow the accelerated grounding in of the higher dimensional world of perfection that has already been formed around, over, and through us to take place. We will begin to be the masters of our own reality and form it around us. As 3D progresses in its collapse, it will release tremendous levels of energy, and that energy will accrue around centering points of higher dimensional grounding, held in the hearts and minds of various beings around the planet who have achieved a level of integration capable of holding such grounding points. This process will proceed exponentially as the catapult force is released further, and what now might appear to most to be an impossible task will happen in the twinkling of an eye. The final body in the numerological cycle is the 9th, called Arthnian. Is the primal tone of creation and can be found integrated in many names, languages, and cultures throughout the indigenous nations of the world. The indigenous tribes, as mentioned earlier, came up from the inner earth to hold the grounding points on the many portals and vortexes of the earth grid system, which is like an energetic skeleton or framework upon which the physical, quote, reality is constructed. In reality, this is what holds the hologram we exist in currently in place. The name of the game during the last 13,000 years has been to remove those gatekeepers from their positions of stewardship and replace the natural resonant grid with an artificially created, maintained, and controlled grid, the Matrix. But like in the movie The Matrix, it only requires one to wake up to the fact that he can be in control of the reality construct, and the whole game changes. The, quote, one in the movie is called Neo, which means, quote, new, and the letters can also be arranged by taking the O from the end of the name and putting it in the front to spell one. Now, is this the, quote, one and only, as most people oriented to the Savior construction might interpret? Or does this mean the one, meaning the collective whole in which we are collectively one unified spirit, while at the same time maintaining our individual identity and individuality? Remember, the earth's great sacrifice was the allowing of the 6 billion laggard souls to retain their individual identity, which is the most valuable and precious gift in the universe, rather than being subsumed back into the primal matrix of undifferentiated creation. We are all both the one as well as collectively one. And as mentioned above, it only does take one to wake up in the hologram to prove that it can be stopped and thus reversed, because the name of the control game has been to remove the individual identity and to entrain the mass consciousness to provide an ongoing energy source of creative life force to the benefit of the few controllers at the top of the food chain. Based on our focus on fear and separation, we have been told we have been someone else's supper, and should they have been able to retain control of the grid and the hologram, we would have been their eternally enslaved food source for a long time to come. In the ancient Hebrew language, derived from an original language of light, means light. Arth in Celtic means bear, as well as being part of the Latin for bear, Ursa. Arthur, of course, comes down to us as the idealization of the true king, the perfected masculine. But in this cycle, we have been discussing the masculine has been distorted to become the dominator, instead of its properly balanced form in relation to the feminine that holds the field through and in which the masculine can then create form, just as the electromagnetic field can hold a charge when the magnetic field allows the electric charge to move through it. When the feminine comes first, as in the Arthnian body, the completion of the cycle of 9, then we move beyond polarity and are not bound by the same laws as previously in the polarity system. At that point, we are free to move via the wave resonance of the languages of light throughout the omniverse of creation, and we become our own center from which our individual expressions of creation can emanate, and we literally have the capacity to create universes. Again, I don't know which year this was written. I just have a guess, but I don't know what year this was written. But I'll continue reading. On November 11th of this year, beginning in Australia at Uluru, Ayers Rock, the permanent and final grounding in of the divine blueprint for ascended Earth was established. Exactly 900 years after the sinking of the island of Lyonese, that occurred with the beginning of the opening of the Jerusalem portal that reaccessed the Atlantean reality. November 11th, or 1111, representing the four pillars at the gateway between the hologram and other layers of reality construction. This blueprint began to resonate throughout the crystalline matrix of the Earth's body, resonating for 7 days per week for 7 weeks, ending on the 31st of December. At that final point, the blueprint was integrated and available to begin to resonate through the biocrystalline matrix of our bodies, through the crystalline spheres of iron in the center of every red blood cell, through the crystalline structure of our bones, and through the spiraling crystalline matrix of our DNA, this simultaneously with the lifting of the 4D overlay. As such, then we begin to resonate with this divine blueprint, and as virtual reality biocrystalline projecting units, as center points of creation, as our own points of cause in divine synchronicity with our true and divine source, we can begin to create the new reality of heaven on earth and earth in heaven, in synchronous alignment with the divine blueprint now established in the true matrix of our planetary sphere. In short, everything is about to change. So that was written in 1999. This next chapter, the next 9 pages were written in April of 2000. Is that what it says? I'll continue. Fascinating shit. The information contained herein is a cumulative development of knowledge and insight based on internal explorations with my wife and partner, Andrea Teal, along with extensive cross-referencing and reading of both traditional and non-traditional sources of information, knowledge and history contained in esoteric literature, and multidisciplinary subjects. For further detail and background and an expanded multidimensional context, an early work entitled Doorway to Alcyone can be ordered. ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... ... gives a phone number. At last but not least, specific acknowledgement and thanks goes to Maitreya, who has worked with us through Andrea for the last 8 years in guiding our explorations and providing important and significant insights and points of information that made the understandings contained herein possible. Maitreya. Why can't I edit this writing? It sucks. I have to sign in. That's horrible. I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to keep going. So I'll return to this. I want to research. Let me write it down, actually. I don't even have any paper. Maitreya is an angelic being. Don't know much about them, but I have come across their channelings before. And Doorway Alcyone. That's for further research. So I'll continue. During the few days leading up to the new year and millennial shift, I attempted to contemplate this essay after leaving off at the end of the sections above. But try as I might, I could not find any energy to engage the rest of this story, and finally gave in to the fact that the energy was not available to finish writing this piece. During the course of the last day of the year, as the energy built through the excitement and celebration of the new millennium dawning around the globe, it became apparent to us why the last section could not be written. The experience and the insights necessary to write the last section were contained in those last moments at the end of the long cycle of time discussed above, and are now ready to be written and discussed herein in the following and final section presented below. During the progression of the last day of December 1999, as we watched a wave of enthusiasm, celebration, and excitement spread across the planet, as the time zone after time zone erupted in unbridled celebrations, something occurred to me. The whole planet was collectively heaving a giant sigh of relief, letting go of all the fears and negative expectations that had been building for years, fueled by the end of the world scenarios, computer meltdown visions, survivalistic preparations and frenzies, and all sort of manner of end time fears. Yes, nothing happened. The Y2K prognosticator stood dumbfounded as all of it evaporated in a quantum expansion of global excitement. It was almost as if, perhaps exactly as if we had collectively been faced with such prospects before and decided that we would not manifest it this time around. It was time to step up to another resonant platform of reality. Even the computers went along with the decision. It reminded me of a story I had been told not too long before. It is a story conveyed from a business that I have been involved in for over 20 years. A business that has an intimate relationship to the play of consciousness on our planet, the business of gemstones and the mineral kingdom. In this story, someone I once knew, who was a very charming and charismatic player in the business, charming, yet deviously selfish, and ultimately without conscience or concern about the welfare of others or the effect of his actions on others. This particular man happened to be heavily involved with the Afghani freedom fighters during the 1980s, who controlled some particularly valuable gem mines on the border of Pakistan. This man was up in those mountains for a number of years, developing a business of dealing with the freedom fighters, setting up large-scale operations to buy their rough gem materials and take them to Bangkok, Thailand, where an associate of his had a gem-cutting factory to process and cut the stones, then take them to the Western markets in the US and Europe. All seemed well with this endeavor at first, except, as was the inevitable conclusion to virtually all of this man's ventures, the financial side of things got out of hand, and eventually he was deeply indebted to the freedom fighters who controlled the mines with whom he was doing business. Now, those freedom fighters are a tough lot, and they were fighting a serious fight over the fate of their country against the Russians. So they took their financial dealings quite seriously. But this global gem dealer, well, he always had a back door and always made sure his needs were taken care of regardless of the consequences he left behind. So when he found out he could not recover himself sufficiently to square the ledger with the mines and the Afghani fighters, he simply left. Only problem was that his son happened to still be up there in the mountains with the freedom fighters. And to the Afghani rebels, according to their ancient traditions and laws, the son is actually responsible for the actions of the father, if it ever comes down to that. So the son, a young man of about 18 or 19 years, was held accountable for his father's actions. He was kept in a prison for some months until his fate was decided. He was to be executed by a firing squad, in front of which, one fine Himalayan day, he was led for sentence to be carried out. We can imagine the kind of emotions this young man felt, between rage at his father at being abandoned and the sheer terror at the prospects he faced. And just as he was about to be executed, something extraordinary happened. He suddenly began to speak to his captors in their own language, a tongue he knew very little about. And not only did he begin to speak their language, but he began to speak of very ancient and esoteric aspects of their culture and their beliefs, of their religion and their secret prophecies. In a sudden rush brought on by the sheer magnitude of the situation and the imminence of his own destruction, he had apparently leaped up to a higher level of consciousness in which he had total access to his own higher self and that of his captors, who put down their guns and began to listen to what he had to say in rapt attention and amazement. The execution was quickly forgotten. Unanimously and without anything further to be said, the young man instantly became a part of this tribe and has been a friend and comrade of theirs ever since. He has since gone on to develop some extraordinary skills in working with the gemstones that they were mining, cutting and sorting and identifying qualities with the keen eye that was part of his newfound consciousness, along with his connection to his former captors. In essence, he decided to make the proverbial quantum leap into a higher level and leave the fear and anger behind. Perhaps this describes what the human race, on a collective level has now decided. Perhaps we were faced with a similar situation of that 13,000 years ago, rather than, as has happened that earlier time, go down and drop to a lower level of consciousness in which fear and survival became the order of the day. A level in which anger at having been abandoned by some distant and careless father and separation from our own divine natures was the choice. We, like that young man in the Himalayan mountains, chose to jump up to the higher octave and choose another level. This is what it felt like to me on New Year's Eve as we watched the exploding fireworks burst into the skies around the globe, feeling the sense of relief as the overlay spoken above was peeled back by the movement of an ascending wave around the world. It felt like humanity had made the choice, and the leap was taken, and our destiny was finally attained. The rest is simply the detail work yet to do. In an earlier part of this essay, we discussed the twin pillars that the twin pillars that have separated our current holographic reality form from that of a former one that we have come to call Atlantis. It was discussed that these two pillars were the guardians at the threshold, holding the resonance of two beings we know as Michael and Zadkiel, fusing the tones and vibrations of those names into what has come to be known as the name of Melchizedek. Michael, in certain traditions, is known as holding a sword, the sword of truth, and Zadkiel, in my own personal experience in recent years, is one who holds another sword, a sword of justice and divine law, sometimes referred to as the sword Excalibur. Together, we can see their combined energies and resonance as divine balance. Because with truth and justice and the foundation of true divine law, we will have balance. And it is balance that all of this is ultimately directing our attention towards. For when we are in a state of integrated balance with ourselves and our surrounding environment, we are in balance with our divine nature and with all creation. It has been a journey about returning to balance, a journey in which we have all played out their respective parts to perfection. In one modern teaching concerning the order of Melchizedek and their universal role in the larger scheme of things, it has been said that a Melchizedek being will come to a planet or a local system to assist it in a dimensional shift. It is said that the essential nature and energetic function of such beings is to provide stabilization to any level of consciousness that is in form and that is moving through a dimensional shift. If such a being is an energetic fusion between the balancing aspects of divine truth and divine justice, two essential elements required if there is to be true balance, then it is through those twin pillars that we must all move during these times of great transition. As such, then, it is the stabilizing force of balance that adheres to these principles will provide. Indeed, it is at this moment that we are beginning to walk through such pillars as gateways back along the lion's path to our destination of reunification with all aspects of ourselves, with the end of the treaty and the removal of the fourth dimensional overlay. The resonance of truth and justice will prevail, and the veils shall progressively be lifted. The matrix shall be shifted and reformulated by a higher order of our own creation as we so choose. The Y2K phenomenon was simply an opportunity. Collectively, we went deep into our subconscious, revisiting racial memories, along with the fear and incredulity of an earlier time when we fell from consciousness because we did not have the balance and integration to maintain the level of creation we had been playing in. To maintain the level of creation we had been playing in. Many parts of ourselves had been separated and left behind, and into that gap came those who would play out the flip side of the drama and force us into the integration that was required to make the quantum step that has now been taken. Those who came to play that role have come down through history as noted above as a reptilian and type humanoid race. But eventually they engaged with that which what they had created, the human race, and once their lot was cast among us, their fate and destiny were placed side by side with ours. Their liberation is really the same as ours. They have been as stuck in the master-slave polarity as we have. Part of the agreement long ago was that they would have an equal opportunity to be released from such bondage and be able to take the next step on the path towards reunion with the divine and eternal aspects of themselves. That is why the true and ultimate lesson to be gained from all of this has to do with the nature of the human heart and the nature of true compassion, mercy, and forgiveness for all that we have done in seeking the door to liberation. It is such a door through our own hearts that we can enter as the keepers of the threshold, open the twin pillars herein described, and we step into a higher realm. Compassion and mercy for those who have played a role that we might describe as evil are misguided, because only then, when we hold that resonance, can they step into the requisite of self-forgiveness, when they realize the consequences of the things that they have done. And this applies equally to ourselves. For all that we have done to transgress from the divine nature with which we are eternally endowed. It is interesting that many ancient traditions speak of the fire of creation as a serpent that resides at the base of the spine, a serpent that awaits activation to burn through the dross of our miscreations towards the crown of our conscious awakening. All the indigenous traditions of this earth speak of the serpentine energy and power. So isn't it interesting that it is the reptilian force that has at once and the same time been the power of life itself, while being a conduit of that which has tried to control the life force on this planet. Life in an agreement with itself, life in an argument with itself. A quantum force of fusion, seeking its own liberation by the energy thus engendered. The Egyptians recognized this with their reverence for reptiles, and especially the use of crocodiles in many of their ceremonies and temples. Many of their sites incorporated pools underneath the initiatory chambers where crocodiles swam and from whom the primal energy could be tapped. Out of this tradition came the anointing process and ceremonies in which the fat from the crocodile was used to identify those who had attained higher levels of consciousness. This fat was known as Mesa, from which a latter word in Hebrew was derived, Messiah, essentially meaning he who was set apart and who was led to lead by virtue of such elevation. The Hebrews learned much of this during the period from around the 18th to the 15th centuries BC, when the Hyksos kings ruled Egypt, then later moved to the land of Canaan during the historical times from which emerged the Old Testament. The Hebrew traditions were really a fusion of Egyptian ceremonial knowledge with Babylonian rules of structure, order, and hierarchical control. The latter was learned during the Babylonian captivity. Oh, I'm tired. The latter was learned during the Babylonian captivity around the end of the 16th century BC and the beginning of the 5th century, during which time the Levite tribe attained positions of power as the priests authorized to hand down the law as they learned of the lineage of the systems of control and power afforded the priestly class. But the real question here is, where did the law come from? Where did the context of the divine right of kings come from? From whence did the priests derive their authority? Was it perhaps something that followed an orderly progression of contractual law, dating all the way back to that treaty that we have been speaking of? A treaty that allowed a certain overlay of consciousness through a particular species and bloodline to dominate this planet for the last 13,000 years. Was it this lineage of law that gradually evolved to the lines of order and hierarchical control we are speaking of? An order and control ultimately intended to design to actually serve us by waking us up from the dream we have been in, to force us to merge and integrate with all levels of our consciousness in order to finally move beyond the matrix and the illusions of this particular time-space continuum. Consider the fact that we could never leave such a confined realm unless we took all parts of ourselves with us. So the whole dream of separation and control has been one in which our ultimate liberation was to be attained. Certainly a possibility to consider. And if that be the case, then we can only step above the current polarized system of good and evil by recognizing that there are no outside enemies, only externalized reflections of internalized imbalances. Indeed, there are no enemies, only opportunities for growth and realignment and rebalancing. And indeed, the devil knows not who he serves. For in establishing the misaligned and miscreated structures with which we have been struggling all these years, the so-called, quote, devil is nothing more than an accretion of the externalized reality necessary to reflect back to ourselves our internal landscape of imbalance in need of repair. Gradually, in the next 5 centuries after the Babylonian captivity, the ensuing progression led to the codification of the Judeo-Christian system of thought in the Western mind, while the eastern half of the party was evolving highly refined systems of art and civilization around the predominantly dragon-centered culture, one half codifying the law, the other half celebrating the fire of the dragon and the power of the serpent. In the West, as an endgame result of the delineation we are following, the cognizance of the Messiah as the leader set apart segued into the Greek word Christos, a word also meaning anointed one. The original Greek word simply meant, once again, those who had attained a level of integration as they ascended into a higher level of consciousness. Through initiatory rites, ceremonies, and consciously directed processes of acceleration. A Christed one, then, was simply he or she who had been anointed and set apart. Essentially, the one, like Neo in the movie, who had broken free from the matrix of controlled consciousness and was able to direct reality from a causal point rather than to be at the control and effect of it. But there was always that other agenda moving along on its parallel track. As the Babylonian and Mesopotamian empires progressed through to the Roman Empire, and then the Holy Roman Empire, in which the codification of the priesthood was elevated to a high art of dominance and control towards the necessary precursor step of preparing mass consciousness from its divinity before its final and ultimate reunification, an unpleasant but necessary part of the process and the plan. Those clever Romans, always ones to recognize a good system when they saw it, they co-opted the next phase of the planetary consciousness within the hologram and took the concept of the Christos and merged it with many so-called pagan rituals, beliefs, and traditions of sun gods. Sacrificial lambs born of virtuous virgins untouched by the sins of the flesh, and all the rest with it, and set up the final game of separation in which humanity was separated from its own divinity and forced to strive towards the unreachable goal of re-attaining such through the auspices of the one and only Church of Holy Rome. A good game, no doubt, to establish that there was really a one and only, and the only way to gain one's soul, which one could not have direct access to, was through its agency, which the Church had the only franchise to, and therefore must be attained through their franchises, the priests. Worship outside of oneself, projecting one's own power and authority and true divine nature outside to an attainable goal. A good gig if you can get it on the franchise, which most of Europe and the New World did, mostly by threat of the pyre or the sword. Thus was born the first form of insurance. Pay the church tithes, obediences, indulgences, and the like, and one might insure a speedier trip to heaven, buying future assurances along the continuum of time in a realm of fear and separation. This is insurance, whereby one hypothecates true title of that which is insured outside of present time, in this case one's soul, and projects it into the future, which guarantees by the insurer that you shall be reimbursed for the use of your soul here in the present by a future payoff. In other words, outside of present reality, and therefore into a realm of illusory security, but in which one can never attain true integration of all aspects of one's being. The true nature of law is centered around the foundational platform of contract. The original contract in the current time zone we have been in for the last 13,000 years is that of the treaty we are speaking of. It is just an educated guess on my part, but it is a good probability that the original treaty has been handed down through cycles, through circles of secret societies, to whose benefit it would be to not let the mass consciousness be aware of this original legal grounding point. It is most likely that the treaty has passed through the hands of the masters, the controllers, and the kings, through each successively ruling empire from Sumer to Babylon, Judea, Egypt, and eventually to Rome. From there, during the last phase of the cycle, the Vatican has established its supremacy in granting kingship through the various bloodlines of the royal houses of Europe, eventually centering its imperial control through the auspices of the City of London and Washington, D.C. In another work, I'm going to write this one down, 1000 Townships, Part 2. Need a pen. 4 pencils and a pen. If I can find these readings, I'll probably read them and bring them here. But I'm not sure I'll be able to find them. But it's possible. I could look for them. In another work, 1000 Townships, Part 2, I have discussed more at length the nature of the hierarchical and pyramidical structure of the legal structure in which legal title and control has been maintained at the top of the legalistic feeding chain. In essence, the entire structure is based on the binding nature of contracts, leading back to the beginning of this cycle as herein discussed. The British Crown and other royal houses issued charters to control and dominate the imperial conquests and colonization of the entire planet. Hey, buddy. I'm doing a reading.
Okay. You want like someone reading like a reading a book or an article?
I'm doing a recording.
Okay.
The British Crown and other royal houses issued charters to control and dominate the imperial conquests and colonization of the entire planet. I'm gonna read that again. They, in turn, owed their allegiance to Rome for the granting of kingship by, quote, divine decree. Even when Henry VIII broke away from Rome, the independence of England was eventually abrogated by its relationship to the City of London and its banking cartels, which were, in turn, no doubt, controlled by strings leading back to Rome and the holder in due course of the original treaty of which we are speaking. A complete understanding of this process is too complex to detail here, but suffice it to say that the bottom line is one of contract and binding adhesion for all people on this planet. Even the so-called Pillar of Liberty, the United States of America, has become nothing more than another pyramid scheme of control and dominance. This time, through a smoke and mirrors trick in which the illusion of freedom and liberty has overlain a deeper level of complete control. This was done by splitting the system in two, starting in 1871, when a dual structure was set in motion by virtue of the creation of a corporation called the United States. In 1933, this corporation was placed into reorganization bankruptcy, and all assets of the formerly sovereign and independent republic states were reconfigured to become assets to back the reorganized corrupt reorganized bankrupt corruption. I'm fucking that up. In 1933, this corporation was placed into reorganization bankruptcy, and all assets of the formerly sovereign and independent republic states were reconfigured to become assets to back the reorganized bankrupt corporation. This included assets all the way down to the citizens of the states themselves. What followed was a complete revision of the original form, a corporatization under one parent entity, which, in reorganized bankruptcy, was controlled by its creditors, leading all the way back to you know where. All of this was neatly wrapped into a complete package by 1966 when everything was placed into what is known as the UCC, the Uniform Commercial Code. Since the federal government was allowed under the Constitution that in 1871 was adopted as the corporate bylaws, to regulate commerce between the states. Each citizen corporate asset was renamed a, quote, state, and all paper that passed through, by, and around each such, quote, state was a commercial document and therefore could be regulated by the Fed by virtue of its power to regulate interstate commerce. And all of this was neatly tied together by the bottom line, which was the adherence of contracts, all of which leads back to the granddaddy of contracts, the treaty that we have been speaking of. But there is a clause that is supreme in that treaty, which must allow for the free will agency of each individual to reclaim their sovereign integrity, to, in effect, rescind and remove all oaths, vows, and binding contracts when they are seen for what they are. Over time, we have all adhered to ourselves many such oaths and binding vows through the tricks of fear, separation from self, religious indoctrination. The word religion comes from the Latin root words, which mean, quote, to bind again, end quote, and other such like nonsense. Ultimately, we must remove such contractual overlays, leading back to that point of original departure, and reattain entry back through the pillars of reintegration and return to balance. When we do so within ourselves, we shall manifest such outside of ourselves in the reality we wish to create. When such a return to original innocence is attained, we are then free and clear to establish a divine contract with our own unique and true source of divine origin. Such a covenant and contract is known in law as a corporation soul. A corporation soul establishes into the physical plane a perpetuity in law, an office in which our corporeal form resides, and to which office we may adhere the fruits of our labor and the manifestations of our creator capacity. Such a covenant is a contract with our prime source, however we may choose to define or describe such source, and no man made lesser agency can intervene, mitigate, or abrogate such a covenant. At the same time, based on the natural laws of balance, integrity, and truth, such a covenant cannot be based on the intention to undermine or parasitically attach to the natural life force of another being. The divine foundational law of such a covenant is that we must honor the life force in all beings and only align with life enhancing thoughts, words, and deeds. The reason for this is that when we establish a direct covenant with our source, we do not need to look outside of ourselves for life sustaining energy and eternal sustenance that such a reunion will provide. During this last cycle we have been discussing, the name of the game has been who controls the grid of the planet. The grid is comprised of lines of force and intersecting points of conversion of two or more such lines, and could be seen as the energetic skeletal structure over which the accretion of the material substance of the planetary body coheres. These points of convergence are what some call vortexes, and others might call portals. The primary portals are points that in reality are interdimensional access doorways between dimensions. If these are controlled and are cut off, then the planetary bodies of the population can be contained within the third dimensional matrix. And if such can be closed off forever, then such bodies and the corresponding individuated souls can be perpetually recycled and utilized, as in the movie The Matrix, as sources of energy to perpetuate the matrix itself. One can easily see where the vertex points and portals are by virtue of outstanding natural formations, as well as where indigenous peoples have built significant constructions of stone. Such constructions have been the grounding points of holding the energetic framework in place. If one is in a game, then one might as well play the game for keeps. Therefore, for those in positions of control and dominance, the focus of the game has been to gain control of these control points of the matrix and the consciousness contained therein. Part of the game plan, then, has been to knock off and destroy those stewarding peoples on such points throughout the world, and then to create an artificial grid that can be controlled and manipulated. Such a grid has been devised through electromagnetic frequencies via the various layers of the electromagnetic spectrum, such as radio waves, electrical grids, and numerous other ways to entrain the biological frequencies that our bodies resonate at to maintain our life functions. Additionally, such devices as buildings, churches, and city design plans have been overlain on important points to further such control of the grid. We have made reference to the fact that the matrix is a hologram. What is a hologram? By definition, a hologram is created by an image being overlain onto the interference pattern created by two converging waveforms. When this is done, the image is contained within every smaller part of the larger whole. What then is the two interference patterns that make up the hologram of the matrix we are talking about? One is the individual and collective life streams of the consciousness of the beings here on the planet as they enter into the third dimensional plane via biological incarnations. The other is the linear construction of the time-space continuum in which this reality is contained. When our consciousness crosses into and engages with the linear form of time-space, we become part of the creation of the matrix and the reality we find ourselves in. If our creative energy can then be entrained into a consensus reality of fear, lack, limitation, and survival, then our creator capacity can thus be utilized to entrap us into such a reality of our own making. If this artificial entrainment can be sustained after the overlay is removed, then perhaps we could be thus contained and controlled indefinitely. This has been the nature of the game by those who have been playing the game for keeps. They as the keepers, we as the kept. But like as in the movie, we have the capacity to wake up and realize that since we are projecting the nature of the reality, we can become the cause and not at the effect of the reality. We can change the picture. This is the opportunity now upon us. Another twist to the end of the treaty. For the ones in control, though, is that when the overlay was to be removed, as it now has been, then the oversouls of such beings had one of two choices. They would either have to leave the domain completely, since they could not stay at the 4D level, maintaining the compression of the third dimension, or the souls would have to fully come into the human bodies they had been overlaying for so long. In other words, the puppet masters would have to either let go of the strings, and the human counterpart would thus be on its own and have to face the consequences of its own actions. Or the oversoul would have to come fully into the body and begin to transmute and integrate with the human component and thus move with the ascending wave of the rest of humanity. This was part of the original agreement that followed for the final play to be one of rebalancing and integration for all the players. Compassion, mercy, and forgiveness, self-applied, as the final act of judgment, each soul dealing with the consequences of its own acts, all on an equal playing field. This is the last act, here and now, for the next 12 years. Such a final act would fulfill a key component of the treaty that if they came in and played out the overlords and gods during this cycle, they would have the opportunity to ascend and integrate themselves, and thereby to achieve the gift of the integrated biocrystalline system and the creative prism of the interwoven matrix of the human genetic code. For the final gift is indeed the body in which we reside, made up of a complex yet beautifully balanced, integrated system of sacred geometric forms, interwoven with a perfectly balanced crystalline matrix of genetic codes from many contributing species and levels of consciousness. As I write this last part, it is now past the first spring equinox of this last phase prior to full activation of the ascension. See, this is interesting. This is a Ken Cousins who this is a different Ken Cousins than we see today. You have to understand that. The Ken Cousins today wouldn't say things like the activation of the ascension. He feels like he's gone through a lot of this illusion, and I don't know if he, I don't know. He's integrated so many different things that he's pulled out of the new age to a high degree. He's not fucking saved by Jesus Christ yet. You know, maybe he needs to get there, but he wouldn't say anything about an ascension. I'll rewind. As I write this last part, it is now past the first spring equinox of this last phase prior to full activation of the ascension. The sense of freedom in operating without the overlay is beginning to percolate down into our conscious reality, and the opportunities for accelerated progress in the rebalancing and integration phase of this whole grand journey is as never before. The exponential expansion is happening faster and faster, yet the center point of ourselves has an opportunity to be at peace within such acceleration as we stand in the position of the master. The blinders and restrictions of forward motion have been removed, and we can move forward via means accessible each to his or her own capacities. This, of course, does not mean that all beings on this planet are currently in a state of bliss. On the contrary, most are grappling with the energies and the consequences of such a release and have to deal with the ultimate issue, which is to face themselves. As each individual being does this, and as the larger collective releases more and more of the illusions we have suffered under, and the energy is being released, is like a huge planetary level catapult force that is literally hurling us upward through the ascension process, carrying the planet itself and all who consciously chose to go with her. For some, this will mean an ever-expanding level of creative capacity as we come into our own as masters of the realm. For others, there will certainly be a continuing progression of trying to deal with the illusions and the distorted pictures of reality as they go further into temporary insanity until such a time as they choose to leave the body or to integrate into wholeness. Many will definitely choose to leave the body, but this is well and good, for they will then have the assistance they need to integrate in ways that they could not deal with in physical form. Most who leave the body will make the transition and will rejoin the progression from another vantage point later on down the path. The good news is that because we are in a hologram, the quantum effect of even a small number of beings achieving the higher level integration will resonate throughout the realm and afford many others a level of assistance in dealing with the process they are undergoing. Therefore, it is of paramount importance that those who are aware of this action work diligently to focus on what is real rather than to engage in which is built of illusion. We cannot change the world, but we can change ourselves and the world in which we choose to give our creative energies. As we do this, ironically, without having intended to change the world, we will establish a level of higher resonance around which the releasing energies from the implosions of the old world institutions shall accrue. This is a key and important point. Do not focus on changing the old world. It is dying, so let it die. And that which is broken cannot be fixed, and that which is real cannot be broken. Focus on what is real, and the rest shall fade away. With the overlay now removed, we have the opportunity to re-access our original blueprints contained in the Akashic records that contain everything we have ever done or experienced on this planet. All is merging into a singularity of consciousness in the integrated wholeness of our divine selves as perfectly reflected in the forms that we now occupy. Should we so choose this as the reality we wish to create for ourselves, the nature of a morphogenic field is such that when one individual or a group begin to resonate at a certain level of energy and frequency, it permeates out through the rest of the matrix, lifting all up in the process. The twin pillars spoken of before literally stand around each cell of our bodies and around each human form. They are centered at the gateway of our hearts, awaiting us to release the illusions that bind us prior to passing through the pillars and to enter into a higher realm. As we do so, the reality we find ourselves in will progressively transform itself, and a new reality will begin to adhere to our resonant forms, vibrating at an ever higher frequency built on a foundation of love and undifferentiated light. Our jobs are now simple. Envision, energize, ground into form, and manifest that which we wish to behold. Heaven on earth, allow the gift of life and breath to return to your spirits as the gift of original innocence, and know that as we stand at the precipice of the ending, we are perched on the threshold of a new beginning as we return to ourselves and thereby come to know ourselves for the very first time. That's really beautiful. I'm really inspired by these words. For further information regarding to the legal structures referenced in Part 4, please contact Capstone Publishing and order 1,000 townships. Additional information pertaining to alternative legal, financial, and resource development projects that we are engaged with, including how to establish a proper legal format for a corporation's soul and many other exciting developments for the full manifestation of a truly new world. Inquire about Universal Resources at the same number. Universal Resources. Capstone Publishing. Oh, I can't even copy anything. So that's the end of the reading. These must be from the, because I downloaded the website, so this is from the website. So let me just look up a few things. Capstone Publishing. Can I just 1,000 townships? Well, it's not quite right. It's not right there. No, I think this is a different Capstone Publishing. Maybe I should Google it. I'm not getting what I want here. Continue without address. I don't want Google to have my fucking address. So it's not out there. Doorway to Alcyone. Let me search his name. So this is what we just read. I just found a Google Docs file for it. Who? Can I see who posted this document? No. Oh, it's online? An introduction to whole system energetics. So it's here on this it's here, currently unavailable. There's another one. Unavailable. Capstone Publishing? Where do I find that? Because it gave me a number, but I think that number is definitely out of date. Here's a little discussion about what we just read from Noble Realms. I don't see why I can't read these comments. Wow, first, thank you for this. I would urge other Noble Realms members to read this history of planet Earth. I would likely have other queries about this. I'm still reading it and didn't want to forget this question. Wouldn't we have known that they would do this? My only answer is that we must have known this to be a dangerous possibility, but it didn't matter because the fruits far outweigh the dangers. That was great. What a wonderful compilation. Succinct summary of so much history. Beautifully put together. Thanks for posting the link. I'm still reading too. Nice to see this in print. I pinged on this. I agree. Those involved in the creation of Atlantis and the universe knew it wasn't intended to last, but it was a step in the experiment to create a body in which creator consciousness could exist in this with the same freedom it has without form, a body that would enhance the conscious ability to explore and understand creative mysteries. This has been long sought after. Here are the sections I found particularly meaningful. In other words, with respect to the savior construct, the human race would not be waiting for an outside force to save it if it were able to integrate its own internal grounding in alignment with its true divine source. Wandering One says, I was a little concerned when I saw the reference to Maitreya in the following section. The Maitreya reference made me think of Operation Terra, where I found that a lot of it resonated with me, but then there were some key deceptions contained in the material. In the Operation Terra case, it appears that the author was not aware that she was promoting what appears to be misleading information. In the case of the Ken Cousins material, one thing that I noticed is that it stated that reptilians had only been here for 13,000 years. Other sources say the reptilians have been interacting with humanity for a lot longer than that. Also, I'm thinking that the reference to Maitreya is the same Maitreya that Benjamin Crane promotes. I went to Benjamin Crane's seminar a few years ago. There were a few hundred people there. After a presentation by Benjamin Crane, everyone was told to hold hands and project their energy into a pyramid that was in the middle of the room. I think that pyramid was meant to be a conduit to a higher dimension or something like that. The group of people did as they were told, since no instruction were given on how long to stay there putting their energy into a pyramid, and it was a long time before anyone said it was okay to stop. People just stayed in the circle holding hands, presumably putting energy into the pyramid. I later heard that it ended up being over an hour, maybe approaching 2 hours. I don't remember exactly. I was one of the first to get up and leave, and I stayed longer than I cared to admit. I guess it shows the power of group conformity. Looking back, the process strikes me as promoting negative, quote, feeding type behavior. Monica says, I'm not into Benjamin Crane or his Maitreya, finding both of those to have rather thick energies. One thing about famous names is that anybody upstairs can use them for credibility, whether they are the entity or not. Another way to look at this, too, is that some are multidimensional so that they may come to one person in a 5D vibe, to another person in a 9D vibe, to another a 13D vibe or whatever. And the info is pertinent only to those in that vibe. And all of the ascended masters have earth-related karma and need to go through layers like we embodied ones do in order to release their, quote, stuff. Some may seem dark in one place and light in another place, but it's the same entity carrying out different responsibilities and integrating dark and light. I haven't read this enough to know what I personally think of this Maitreya, but thought I'd share my views on the possibilities. Well, that's all from this website. I found this another website. It's actually kind of long. Earth Grid and Gaia. It has a fucking phone number on it. Ageless Wisdom Updates. The Cosmic Beings and Polarity Integration. Our galactic family is assisting as we progress as a whole humanity. Within our immediate universal neighborhood, there are also 8 sources of light, which are 8 gateways that are now integrating within the microcosm of ourselves. From Ken Cousins' Doorway to Alcyone. There's actually some interesting stuff in here I'd like to read, but what's this list right here? Human races and their history. What else is in here? Polarity game. The Earth experiment. Well, I think that's all I'm going to touch on for now. So thanks for joining me for this reading. I can't find his other writings, but I will lead with this. I found a group called Heart Center Community. Maitreya. Oh, that's not what I want. Heart Center Community. I want that. It's not even here. No. No. So here's quite a lot of channelings from David Christopher Lewis. Heart Center Community on YouTube. And there's a lot of channelings from Maitreya. Quite a lot. Didn't know there was this many. Looks like about 20. And their classes are free, I'm pretty sure. Maybe I should take this class. I am on their Meru University website. Maitreya Buddha speaks on Mu, Atlantis, and the New Earth. No, it's pretty fucking far out there. Pretty fucking far out there. So, that's all for this reading. If you want to find more from Ken Cousins, you should be sure to check out his Freedom Absolute channel. You can just search Freedom Absolute on YouTube. You'll find it. There's a paid subscription model to learn more about contracts. He touched on that work, a lot about contracts and the initial contract, the big contract that all these other contracts relate to. I found that very interesting. So that's mostly what his work is about, is freeing yourself from contracts and invisible contracts, contracts you didn't know were there, but you're bound to nonetheless. Freedom Absolute. Find it. And thank you for joining me for this very long video. I've been Nicole Jera. Have a nice night. Goodbye.